Hey, how's it going today, everybody? My name is Will Tran with the Filmmakers Code. Today we're talking about how do we shoot a cinematic video with an iPhone. Now, what you just saw was entirely shot on an iPhone 13 Pro, which of course is a very powerful tool when it comes to cameras. It's not the 14 Pro because I don't plan on upgrading to it, and I've heard that the lenses are softer than the 13 Pros anyway. While shooting cinematic videos with the iPhone is starting to become as simple as whipping out the native camera app on the phone and hitting the record button, there are going to be situations where it's not as straightforward, and we'll go over all of that in this video right here. All right, so tip number one, shoot at 4K 60 frames a second. One of the best ways to shoot cinematic videos with any camera is to shoot in 4K 60. Now we shoot in 4K for obvious reasons, for better picture quality and more control in post-production. 60 FPS is for slow motion, so we can slow all of our footage down and speed it up at will. Using 60 frames a second is a way to capture grandiose events like the water fountain at the Bellagio in the full video. Check that out by clicking on the eye. However, you should only shoot in 60 frames a second whenever you know that you will be putting footage into slow motion. When I'm shooting a cinematic travel video like this, I don't really know what shots I'll be putting into slow motion and which ones I'll keep in real time, so therefore I simply just shoot it all in 60 FPS. Something that the iPhone does right is that when shooting at 60 frames, the phone will automatically lock the shutter speed to exactly 1/20th of a second. The downside to this is that the only way that it will adjust brightness is by changing the ISO, and the iPhone sensor is really small, so when raising the ISO, the image results in a lot of grain, which is why the phone does tend to struggle in low light. Now, when shooting something like an interview or a dialogue scene, you should be shooting at 24 frames a second. However, that is a completely different situation that we're talking about here, so check out our 30-minute filmmaking training video if you want to learn more about that. At the same time, one of the biggest reasons why I shoot in 60 frames when creating a cinematic video like this is because the slow motion smooths out my camera movements after slowing the footage back down to 24, which leads me to my next point. Number two, use cinematic camera movements. Cinematic camera movements are one of the best ways to separate an amateur filmmaker from a professional. In every movie or TV show that you watch, you may notice that the camera doesn't always stay completely still on sticks. Even in simple dialogue scenes, the camera may move subtly just to keep you engaged. The thing that I was most impressed by in the iPhone 13 Pro was its image stabilization. Guys, the stabilization is almost like that of a gimbal. Now, if you plan to shoot a lot of things on your phone, then I'd still suggest getting yourself a gimbal like the DJI Osmo, even though the iPhone stabilization is already amazing. The reason for this is that in low light situations, the phone does tend to lose its smoothness, which required a little bit of warp in post-production. The top cinematic camera movements that we used in this video were the push in, where we slowly walk forward with the camera, and the parallax, where we move in one direction and pan in the opposite direction. There are plenty of more cinematic camera movements, and again, you can learn more of those in our 30-minute filmmaking training webinar. Number three, use correct focal lengths. The iPhone 13 Pro literally has 3 different focal lengths for you to utilize, so use them. A very big amateur filmmaking move is shooting every single shot on a wide angle lens. Take a look at how we utilize all 3 focal lengths in the video. When I'm trying to capture expansiveness in a scene, like when we were at the Grand Canyon, I use the widest angle lens, or 0.5x zoom, which is the equivalent to about a 13mm lens. I used the 0.5x zoom on any scene that needed depth, like a really grandiose hall, or the Fountain of Gods, a valley, or a big building. Wide-angle lenses express depth and expansiveness, so use a wide-angle lens when trying to capture the entirety of your environment in your shot. Next, let's talk about the standard lens, which is the 1x zoom, which says it's the equivalent to about 26mm. I'm not too sure about that, as the standard lens does seem to be much more zoomed in at about maybe 35 to 40mm. It's a tiny sensor, so I guess it makes sense. But anyways, we use the 1x zoom whenever we're only trying to capture one object or detail. For example, this shot of one of the statues at the Fountain of Gods. We're only focused on this statue because that was the focus for that particular shot and not anything else. If we shot this on a wide angle, the statues become lost in the frame, like in this shot right here. However, the focus in this shot is the entirety of the fountain, not just one particular statue. Moving on to the 3x zoom, the equivalent to about a 77mm lens. This is used when you're trying to capture small details or, again, a single subject. A telephoto lens like this heavily compresses the background and makes your subject stand out, like the shot of the god at the Fountain of Gods, or the last shot of me at the end of the video. You can see that these shots only have one subject, and you're only focused on that subject and you're not distracted by anything else. Let's take a look at 2 similar shots but on different focal lengths. Here's a shot of my sister standing on a rock looking out at the Grand Canyon. In one shot, we use the widest angle lens, the 0.5x zoom, to capture the expansiveness of the Grand Canyon. Whereas in the other shot, we used a longer focal length, the 1x zoom, to capture a section of the canyon that my sister was looking at. You see how a wider angle lens makes objects look smaller and further away, while a longer lens makes everything look more or less the same size? Now you can zoom digitally between the three focal lengths to get a more specific zoom. However, I don't totally recommend doing this because you're zooming digitally and you're going to be losing quality as you zoom. I know that most of us are probably watching this video on a tiny phone screen, and so you probably don't notice too much quality loss or grain, though I rarely found myself in a situation where one of the lenses didn't do the job and I had to digitally zoom a little bit. So I recommend just staying with one of the zoom options that the phone gives you and not going in between them unless you absolutely have to. Overall, look at your surroundings, look at your subject, and determine what lens you're going to use for every single shot. Number 4, use cinematic mode sparingly. I know some of you are probably freaking out right now. Now, the biggest benefit to cinematic mode is that you get the ability to rack focus, which mimics that of a low aperture lens on a normal camera. However, it's not legitimately racking focus because of a low aperture, it's actually putting a blurry filter across certain parts of the image to make it seem like it's racking focus. Now, admittedly, at times it does pretty dang well, and I could be fooled that certain shots were shot on a camera with a low aperture lens. But sometimes the filter didn't work well enough, blurring out the edges of my subjects and missing finer details like hair. Now, at the same time, you can't access your widest angle lens and you can only work with a 1x and 3x zoom. However, the biggest problem that I have with this feature is that you can only shoot up to 1080p 60 frames a second in cinematic mode, which honestly, I don't even know why they didn't even give 4K as an option in cinematic mode. I understand that you can shoot 4K cinematic mode on the 14 Pro, but I don't really understand why this wasn't even thought of when making the cinematic mode an option for the 13 Pro. You also can't shoot 4K 60 on the 14 Pro cinematic mode either, I don't think. So utilize cinematic mode sparingly only when you really want a rack focus shot. And number 5, use the Pro Movie app, or use another third-party camera app like Filmic Pro. The reason you want a third-party app instead of the native camera app on the phone is for control. Something that does tick me off a little bit about the iPhone's camera app is that I cannot control the temperature of my image. It's constantly changing on me. So my image would go from cool to warm in the middle of my shot or vice versa. So I have to use a third-party app in order to control that. Again, the downside to the third-party app, at least for Pro Movie, is that I can't access my wide-angle lens, but at least I can control the basic exposure functions like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and I can control and lock my color temperature to whatever I want, like a normal camera. Apple, this still isn't an option in the iPhone 14 Pro, I don't think. So please give us temperature control and access to the wide angle lens and 4K 60 in cinematic mode. Now, what are my thoughts about the iPhone's camera? Can an iPhone create cinematic videos? Absolutely, it's a very powerful tool for beginners. Can an iPhone replace a standalone camera that is designed for only one purpose, and that's shooting video? No, it cannot. I'm not saying that the iPhone cameras aren't good. You guys literally just saw what we did with it. But a lot of people tend to think that it's just as easy as turning on the cinematic mode and suddenly the image will look good. No. The reason why experts can take a phone and shoot something amazing with it is because they've worked with actual cameras and they understand cameras and cinematography so well to the point that when they are faced with the limitations of the iPhone, they understand those limitations and can work around them to get the best image possible. Anyways, there you have it, my top 5 tips to shooting cinematic iPhone videos. And if you want to learn even more about filmmaking techniques to make your indie films better, be sure to check out our 30-minute filmmaking training, like I mentioned before, by clicking the I in the top right corner or the link in the description below. Other than that, everyone, remember your work is only just as good as the fun that you had creating it. My name is Will Tran, and I'll see you in the next video.